of CLMPST. The first talk, the talk of Márton Gömöri from the Institute of Philosophy of Hungarian Academy of Science. Why do outcomes in a long series of rolling fair dice approximately follow the uniform distribution? Márton, please.
Thanks so much. Yeah, so this is the question that I'd like to ask and answer in this talk. So you might think that there is an easy answer for this question, invoking some notion of probability and maybe some probabilistic laws like the law of large number or something like this. So in what follows, I will explicitly reject such an account, and I'd like to outline for you a new sort of account for this question. The main one of the main characteristics of which is that it will not refer to the notion of probability at all. So I intend this as a case study for a general account or interpretation of probability, mainly applicable for deterministic situations. So here we go. Suppose you roll a fair die a large but finite number of times. So it's an empirical fact that each of the 6 outcomes will occur with around relative frequency 1/6. So that's just a robust physical phenomenon. And the question I'd like to ask is this: what is the physical explanation of this physical phenomenon? So consider the mechanical description of rolling of a dice. So that's a deterministic system, so the mechanical initial data unambiguously predetermine which phase the dice is going to land on. So you can conceive the set of possible initial conditions. This is phase space, and then you can assign to each initial condition the outcome that this particular initial condition will lead to. And in this way, you obtain a partition of phase space into 6 cells. Now, if the die is fair, that's going to imply that each of these 6 phase space volume will have the same size. Well, that's because if one of them were bigger, then that would mean that that outcome would be physically preferred somehow over the other, and we no longer regard the dice as a fair one. So now if you roll the dice, that's going to pick a point in phase space that the initial condition that is realized by that roll, and if you roll the die a large number of times, that's going to pick a large sample from phase space. Now, if the relative frequency of each outcome is around 1/6, that just means in terms of phase space that the initial conditions in this sample are approximately uniformly distributed among the 6 phase cells, right? So given the deterministic dynamics, that's just logic. So if you want to explain why you have that uniform distribution over the outcomes, what you have to explain is why you have this uniform distribution over the space of initial conditions, right? So that's what I'd like to answer now. But before giving my own answer, let me flash a few possible answers that I think will not do the job. So first of all, let me emphasize that the distribution of the initial conditions in this series of rows, that's a matter of objective physical fact, right? And it's not related at all with our lack of knowledge about the distribution or about the lack of knowledge about the details of this process that selects this initial distribution. Secondly, there might be a thought that the sort of frequencies that we talk about might eventually be founded on the indeterminism that is to be found in the fundamental ontology, possibly described by quantum mechanics. So I just want to clarify that even if one assumes that the process that selects this distribution is indeterministic, this in itself does not ensure that this distribution is going to be uniform, right? So the mere fact that this distribution is not predetermined by anything, that's not going to ensure this uniform distribution. Third thought, so there's increasing excitement in the philosophy of probability literature about what is called the method of arbitrary functions. So I assume that most of you are familiar with this reasoning. So the idea here is that given the dynamics satisfy some conditions, so it's chaotic in some sense, there's a sensitive dependence of the outcome on the initial conditions. So given this property of the dynamics, it is argued that, well, an arbitrary or an almost arbitrary initial distribution will be driven to the same distribution of outcomes, namely the one corresponding to these 1/6 frequencies. So this reasoning might be applicable in some idealized mathematical model of the situation when we talk about a smooth initial distribution, but it's certainly not applicable to our case where we have a finite distribution over phase space, right? So the reason is elementary. So again, no matter what the dynamics is, the relative frequencies of the outcomes will only be approximately 1/6 if we have a uniform distribution among these 6 phase spaces. So that's again just a logic, independently of how this deterministic dynamics looks like. And note also that this condition, this blue condition, is a non-trivial condition, no matter whether the dynamics is chaotic or not. So this is not going to be satisfied by an arbitrary initial distribution. And so it is actually very easy to see that the ratio of those initial distributions within the space of all initial distributions that satisfy this condition will not be altered no matter whether the dynamics is chaotic or not. So it seems quite evident to me that if you want to understand why the initial conditions are distributed in a certain way, then it's not sufficient to refer to the dynamics that drive the initial conditions to the outcomes, but you essentially need to refer to the process that selects these initial conditions. So last thought that I like to consider is this. So you might think that, well, the uniform distribution is not singled out by dynamic consideration, but it simply follows from a combinatorial reasoning, and that somehow was what the so-called typicality account argues. So if you want to distribute n points among 6 cells, 6 buckets, then it is easy to see that if n is large, then the majority of ways in which you can distribute these points among the 6 cells will correspond to the uniform distribution. So in this sense, the uniform distribution is typical within the set of all distributions, while a non-uniform one is exceptional. Well, this is just a simple variant of Boltzmann's combinatorial reasoning. So, and then you might think, well, this is just a distribution that you should expect. Now, the problem with this reasoning is that the notion that something is typical with respect to a certain natural measure has nothing to do with what's actually realized. So you may imagine that now the rolling of the die is performed by a robotic arm, and this is governed by a computer program which can calculate how to set the initial data to obtain a desired result, and you can conceive a situation where you always get 6 in a large series. So the uniform distribution is still typical, but it has nothing to do with what's actually realized. So now, well, one might think, yeah, of course, if the rolling of the die is such that it is biased in favor of a particular outcome, well, there is no wonder that we will not get the uniform distribution. But well, one might say, if the process that singles out the initial condition is such that it is not biased in favor of any outcome, then the distribution of initial conditions will be approximately uniform among the 6 cells. So I do think that this is the correct principle that eventually explained why we have the uniform distribution, but this has absolutely nothing to do with typicality nor any of the considerations that we've been seeing so far. I think that in fact this is a causal principle which is just a special case of the common cause principle, and then this is what I'm going to explain now. So how is this a special case? Consider this simple example. So you have a large number of balls on a table. Each of them may have one of 6 colors, right? So 1/6 of the balls are red, 1/6 green, etc. So someone comes to the table and picks a large sample, right? And so now you ask, what's the relative frequency of picking a ball with a certain color? And well, if the agent can seize the ball's color, well, I don't know, she might like white balls more and she only picks white balls, we have no idea. But now, to compare this to a case where the agent is blindfolded. So in this case, one has the strong intuition that the relative frequency of picking a ball with a certain color should be around 1/6. So why is that so? So I think the answer has 2 ingredients. One is the notion that in the blindfolded case, this trial constitutes an unbiased sampling of the balls, in the sense that while in the case where the agent sees the ball's color, the color of the balls can causally influence the process of picking, and thereby the fact that as to which ball is going to be picked. Whereas in the blindfolded case, the ball's color has no causal influence on the process of picking, right? So I think this is what the notion of an unbiased trial or sampling process boils down. So it is unbiased in this causal sense that the fact as to which ball is picked is causally independent from the fact as to which ball is of which color, right? So by causal independence here, this does not only mean that because of the blindfolding, the ball's color cannot have influence on the process of picking, but I also assume here that causal independence means that reversely, the process of picking does not influence the ball's colors. Moreover, I assume that there is no common causal connection between the color properties and the process of selection. So all in all, I think the essence of this unbiasedness of the sampling is this complete causal independence between the color properties and the process of picking. No direct, no common causal connection. Now, the second component is this. So, conceive the balls on the table as a statistical ensemble. Each ball has a certain color property. Now, suppose that the agent picks a large sample. In this way, each ball acquires a further property of either having been selected in the sample or not having been selected in the sample. So now we are going to compare the distribution of these two sorts of properties, namely the color property and the selectiveness property, right? So in particular, I want to ask whether there is correlation between the distribution of these two properties over this ensemble. And now here comes the common cause principle in the question. So the common cause principle says that can be no correlation without some causal explanation of this correlation. So now assume that the sampling process is unbiased in this causal sense, that there is no direct nor common causal connection between the selectiveness property of the balls and the color properties of the balls. Well, that means that due to the common cause principle, there can be no statistical correlation between the distribution of the color properties and this selectiveness property, right? So statistical independence means that the ratio of a certain color in the selected subensemble must be approximately the same as the ratio of a color property within the whole ensemble of balls, right? That's just what statistical independence means. Now, the ratio in the selected ensemble is nothing but the relative frequency of picking of a certain color, right? And we know that each ball has a relative ratio, each color occurs with relative ratio 1/6 in the whole ensemble. So this means that the relative frequency of picking a ball with a certain color will be guaranteed to be 1/6, given this unbiasedness of the trial plus the common cause principle statement. So now let me quickly finish with applying this idea to the dice case. So what I want to suggest here is that the rolling of a die can be understood as an unbiased sampling of phase space in the very same way as the blindfolded agent's pick is an unbiased sampling of a ball from the table. So rolling of a die picks a pointing phase space, and it's unbiased in the sense that there is no influence on the process of picking from the fact as to which phase space point has which outcome property, right? Otherwise, we would not regard the rolling of a die as a fair trial, right? It would be biased. And now, suppose again that you pick a large sample. Due to the common cause principle, that would mean that if you compare the distribution of the outcome properties and the selectiveness properties, then these two properties must be approximately statistically independent over the ensemble of points in phase space. So that just means again that the ratio of an initial condition of a certain outcome type, say 2, within the selected subensemble must be approximately the same as the ratio of this type of initial condition in the whole ensemble, which we know because the die is fair is just 1/6 for each outcome property. So you see, since there we have just the relative frequency of obtaining the outcome 2 in a series of trials, what we see is that we have the result that each outcome will occur with around relative frequency 1/6, right? So I outlined for you an explanation of why should be so, given the unbiasedness of the trial as a causal condition, plus the common cause principle, and I made no reference at all to the notion of probability. Okay, so I think I should just stop here. Thanks for your attention.
Comments, questions?
Okay, so it seems to me that what's going to determine the frequency of the outcomes is relation between the way in which the initial conditions are mapped to the outcomes, right? So in other words, the way in which the different outcomes are distributed over the initial conditions, they're mapped with the cells, and the distribution of the selection of the initial conditions that's determined by the process of selecting. So, for example, if we have, if the initial conditions are selected in a uniform way over a certain space, but the outcomes are distributed in a highly non-uniform way in that space, so that, for example, the 6 region is much, much larger, then even if there's no common cause, we're going to get a lot more 6s, right? And likewise, even if the region of the space of initial conditions, even if those 6 regions are equal in size, but say the die is rolled by a machine that just tends to roll the die the same way every single time, and maybe the way in which it rolls the die every single time falls in that 6 region, then again, even if there's no common cause, we're still going to get a lot more 6s. So the question then is, how do you ensure that in the case of a lack of common cause, the process for selecting initial conditions is going to be distributed uniformly relative to the way in which the outcomes are distributed over the initial.
So in either of those cases, so in the second case you were mentioning, there actually is a correlation between the outcome properties of the phase points and the selectiveness property. So if the common cause principle is true, then in that case there must be either a direct causal influence or a common causal one.
Well, maybe I'm not understanding what you mean by common cause, because in the example I'm suggesting, the designer of the machine, let alone the machine, has no awareness whatsoever about the distribution of the outcomes in the initial conditions. It's not choosing the 6s because they're 6s. It just tends to choose them accidentally, but always in the same way, or mostly in the same way, right?
But if it's accident, so then there is an accidental correlation which is ruled out by the common cause principle. So
Okay.
that's exactly what the principle rules out.
Okay.
Matthias?
More question?
Yeah, actually, I was just going to jump in here and maybe try to say something on your behalf. I would have said the first case is no problem at all, because, I mean, it's just if you take the balls and which just happen to be overwhelmingly red balls, then of course you're getting to pick much more red balls in the sample. In the second case, I would have said, well, just somehow accidentally put the die in the machine. But now, if it's really supposed to be a case where every single time the die is approximately rolled the same way, then unless it's this kind of fluke we rule out, there must be some kind of causal connection that the die is then, again, put in the same way. I mean, somehow by happenstance, you pick the die in some way to put it in, and that's not related with the 6. But then there's a cause. I mean, unless it's pure this cosmic coincidence which you want to rule out, presumably there's some kind of causal connection between the way you put in the die the first time and then the way the machine grabs it the second time and grabs it the first time and so on. And then you have this causal link that you want to exclude. So it's unclear to me how you could get this kind of, that is completely, there's no causal link and it's not a kind of cosmic coincidence that you wrote that kind of cause principle in this kind of overwhelmed machine.
I mean, I could make up a story, I think, that would work. So you've got another machine that manufactures dice. It places them on the table a certain way. It doesn't know one from a 6. But it manufactures dice, it places them on the table in a certain way. The other machine picks them up, throws them in a certain way. There's no causal connection between the outcome and the initial conditions. I mean,
manufacturing. I'm sorry, I mean, but it was now it's the manufacturing that it doesn't. The manufacturer doesn't know it's a 6, but it's the kind of mechanism that puts them on the table always exactly the same way. That's the kind of common cause of it. Sorry.
okay.
More questions? No?